what in the world is the U.S. trying to accomplish? It's vulnerable on all sorts of dimensions. And yet the U.S. president, Donald Trump, is behaving as if he has all the cards to play.
China has its own trump card if the U.S. decides to go really hard, which is its control over critical minerals. You know, this could all get pretty ugly if it is allowed to spiral.
Should we be more afraid of an erratic, infuriating, rumbustious America or a very calculating, incredibly domineering, cost-effective China? Hello and welcome to Trump World with me, Matt Fry. Anushka is traveling again, but she will be back next week, I promise. Now, in another bid to force Iran to succumb to his will, Donald J. Trump has launched Operation Economic Outcast. But is it America who's becoming the international outcast in all this? Trump has already infuriated many of America's traditional allies with his tariff policies, not least his biggest neighbour and trading partner, Canada. Those not-so-quiet Canadians are making a habit out of standing up to the bully in the White House. Today, they're retaliated by matching Trump's massive tariffs. So who will support America if they end up taking on China after Beijing promised to protect itself by all means necessary if the White House enforces its economic onslaught, as they called it, against those who trade with Iran? Well, last time Donald Trump picked a trade fight with Xi Jin Ping, it was China that won. Is recent history about to repeat itself? To unpeel that onion, I'm joined by Soumaya Keynes, who's a Financial Times columnist, co-author of How to Win a Trade War, and yes, the great-great-niece of one John Maynard Keynes, and Leslie Vinjamuri, who's president and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome to you both. Okay, let's start with Iran then. I mean, we've talked about this before, Soumaya. Trump has been very unsuccessful in bending Iran to his will. Why did he impose these particular sanctions? And do you think they might actually make a difference? Because I said in my introduction, picking a fight with China doesn't always go Trump's way.
Yeah, so I think the frustration with the sanctions is that they're not being completely complied with, right? So Trump doesn't want anyone to buy anything from Iran. Other countries are nevertheless still doing so. And, you know, historically, America's power came not just from its ability to hit countries directly, but from its ability to hit a whole network, so to hit everyone who was doing business with the country state actor it didn't like. And so, you know, this recent effort is to try and, you know, make certain actors in China comply with the American sanctions. Xi Jinping, you know, they don't like the look of being bullied by America to behave in a certain way. And of course, China has its own trump card if the US decides to go really hard, which is, you know, its control over critical minerals supply chains. So my prediction is, you know, yes, the US has a bit of leverage. You know, financial sanctions aren't fun. These economic spats are troublesome. No one really wants them. But if Trump decides to turn this into a really ugly wrestling match between the US and China, then the Chinese have a pretty strong hand.
And Leslie, explain the financial nature of these sanctions. So this is about, you know, worst case scenario, trying to cut China if it's proven to do trade with Iran, which of course it does. It buys most of Iran's oil. You know, it cutting them out of the dollar system of finance around the globe. Can they do that? And how damaging would that be to China?
I mean, I think you got to start first with what in the world is the U.S. trying to accomplish? You know, go back to that memorandum of understanding. And the goal at that point, or the strategy at that point, was fundamentally different. It was, you know, give Iran a lot of money, go light on sanctions, go soft, with the hope that then they will reach a deal and that Strait of Hormuz will be open. Now it's failed. And there's the opposite tack. Go very, very tough on economic sanctions. Those secondary sanctions, try to get everybody on board with the hope that you get the same outcome, which is get a deal and get the Strait of Hormuz open. And so there's sort of two parts. One is, you know, can Donald Trump use this strategy to actually get others on board? We all know that sanctions don't work unless everybody comes on board them. And the second part is whether the theory of the case is right, that if you put more pressure on Iran, that it cedes the way and sort of, complies and opens up the Strait of Hormuz. That's a very, very unlikely scenario. We've seen Iran is very willing to resist, that it's divided internally. The hardliners have no interest in conceding. So even if Donald Trump could get China, the UAE, and Turkey on board by applying the secondary sanctions, seems very unlikely that it will be successful. It's still not clear that he could then be effective in getting Iran to reopen the strait. So I think both parts of those equation are deeply problematic.
Indeed, Leslie. And of course, the thing that has really surprised him and indeed many others has been Tehran's resilience in all this. But we also know that the Iranian economy is in a terrible state. I think inflation is at something like 90%. Unemployment is rising. We know that economic problems caused all these mass protests at the beginning of the year, which were put down brutally. And I can see America's thinking here, make their economic situation even worse, and that might make the regime buckle. However, I wonder whether they're going too far, Leslie, with these sanctions, because the thing that's making the Iranian economy buckle is the blockade of the blockade put up by the Americans. Why don't they just carry on with that and not bother picking a fight with China at the same time?
Well, because it's clearly not working, right? The proof is in the pudding. No matter how, and you're absolutely right about the state of Iran's economy, but it has, it is a deeply autocratic regime, understatement of the year, that is more than willing to pass off the costs onto its people, and they are simply not aligned internally on what the next steps should be with respect to the United States. I think that the big question, of course, is also, as you've mentioned, can the U.S. really get China on board? No, China's made it very clear that it isn't going to play ball with this strategy. It's implicitly, if not explicitly, threatened its own form of retaliation. And it's very clear that China wants a negotiated settlement, wants to see some sort of resolution. Everybody wants stability back in the region, but has a very different theory of the case as to how you achieve that. And so it's very hard to see how America's recent threat of sanctions is likely to do anything but engender a further backlash that reduces even further the goodwill for this current administration's set of policies.
Sumaya, do we know to what extent China still relies on Iranian oil? I've read that actually the amount of Iranian oil that they're importing, even though they're still Iran's biggest client, has decreased dramatically since the beginning of this war.
Yeah, I mean, the big surprise in the global economy this year has really been how much China has reduced its imports and consumption of oil. Now, internal Chinese data is not easy to come by. I think there's kind of an open question of how much of what exactly China has been doing, right? Has it been using its stockpiles? Has it just reduced its use, its consumption? Depending on which of those is true, that kind of vulnerability would be different. So it's not entirely clear. But what does seem to be clear is that China has been much, much more responsive to the shock than previously anticipated. They've imported much less oil than anyone thought. They're obviously a big buyer. They can turn to other sources of energy. They've, coal plants been fired up, that sort of thing. So it hasn't been as bad as originally expected. But the thing about stockpiling, if they are coping with this by drawing on their stockpiles, and this applies to the countries around the world. At some point, those stockpiles run out.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder also, Sumaya, whether the Chinese are thinking. I've just thought of this, so it may be a completely stupid proposition. They're thinking of possibly putting more pressure on Scott Bessent and his current problems with treasury bills by threatening to sell large numbers of them, because that would really mess things up, wouldn't they? For the Americans?
Yeah, I don't have a mind tunnel into the brain of the Chinese leadership and whether they're thinking of making that harder. I think, to be honest, it's hard enough for the Treasury without the Chinese intervening. So I'm not sure they necessarily need to.
Yes, possibly. But I mean, the reason why Scott Bessent so graciously intervened in the Japanese, in the yen the other day was partly because he wanted to prevent the Japanese from flogging treasury bills. And, that would be really bad news if you're getting rid of all those assets. It would obviously undermine their own balance sheet as well. I mean, maybe, Leslie, I don't know if you've got an opinion on this. Is that something the Chinese might be considering? Because that is definitely one of America's weak spots at the moment.
I mean, the funny thing about the United States right now is that it's vulnerable on all sorts of dimensions. And yet the U.S. president, Donald Trump, is behaving as if he has all the cards to play, not recognizing China has clearly demonstrated during President Trump's second administration that they have plenty of cards to play. And yet Trump is sort of trying to wield a power that, quite frankly, he just doesn't have. He is, though, if you look both at Canada and at the Canada U.S. current trade politics, and also at the Operation Economic Outcast, there's sort of a delay on the U.S. part, right? He's best into saying there will be the secondary sanctions. Donald Trump is going to pick up the phone and call everybody and say what's coming, but give them time. And that kind of leads you back to the taco. Is Trump going to chicken out again on this? Is this a real threat that's going to be delivered, or is this going to be a series of wins that he can articulate to the American public and across the world?
Do you think he's going to chicken out again, Sumaya, out of this one, despite all the blustery language? Yeah.
He does have form. I mean, this is his thing, right? No one knows. He's an unpredictable guy. He doesn't always follow logic. He's got these pressures, right? You've got the midterms coming up that, should be influencing him a certain way to, reduce the price pressures. He really wants oil prices to be good for the next election. But then he does seem like a man who's kind of untethered from some of these strains of logic. So,
I mean, your book is called How to Win a Trade War. Is he going about it the right way? I mean, what's the recipe for winning a trade war, and does Trump match it?
If he wants me to read out the book to him in person, I'm available.
He's probably got the audiobook right now. I'm not sure if he's into economic books, even if they're audiobooks.
Let's assume he's very interested.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the messages from the history and the economics of trade wars is that they're really, really hard to fight and win, right? And we're seeing this with sanctions, right? You can't just put a sanction on one country and hope that you're done with it. You need to make sure that everyone is complying. These tools are really, really hard to use. They have horrible unintended consequences, right? There are many ordinary people in Iran who are suffering right now through no fault of their own. And in partly that's, the unintended consequences of these economic weapons that are being deployed. And so given how difficult they are, it is incredibly important that you have a clear strategy, that you don't try to fight all the wars at once. Don't pick your battles on too many fronts is some age-old military advice. Be careful about what you're doing, right? And that sounds incredibly basic, but it does feel like a lesson that maybe the president individually hasn't fully internalized. Because, in both the Iran case, in the Canada case, you've got these huge mismatches in power and in strength. And yet, it doesn't look like the US has, dealt the final blow, despite his willingness to wield all this economic weaponry. So it is really complicated. Maybe he should read the book.
But also, listen, I mean, he's taking notes as we speak. It's complicated, isn't it? We mustn't conflate too many things. But he's clearly trying to use trade as a geopolitical tool, either to bend the country like Iran to his will. And in Canada's case, it seems to be a combination of bending a country to his will, but also leveling what he would call the playing field and making it more fair for American businesses. But, so they're related, but they're different at the same time. So just to wrap up the Iran thing, Leslie, it's not as if Iran has not had sanctions before. I mean, they've been living with sanctions for decades. And those sanctions have not brought down the regime. Maybe America thinks that this is now, the regime is at such a weak point that this time round, those secondary sanctions, putting pressure on countries like China that trade with Iran, will be the final death knell for the regime. But frankly, having spoken to lots of people inside Iran and outside, I can't see that coming. Maybe I'm missing a point here. Leslie, what do you think?
No, I don't see it. I don't see it working. And in the past, when the U.S. Has successfully used both the wielding of sanctions and the offer to lift them, and I'm thinking back to the JCPOA negotiations, the Iran deal negotiations, 2015, they did it alongside extraordinarily focused, long-standing negotiations, right? So, the threat of sanctions and then the promise of lifting them was very successful. If you go back a decade, more than a decade. The problem, of course, now is that America is not seen to be reliable. It's not negotiating in a serious, detailed, focused way with expert negotiators. We simply haven't seen that. And so sanctions on their own, and when they're effectively bilateral, when there aren't that many others who are fully on board, and that is, to the Trump administration's credit, they recognize sanctions don't work if others are violating them. But America has played its hand very badly when it comes to getting others to come along its strategy, because, go back to the beginning of this bombing campaign and they didn't consult with anybody. So they've just had a hard time getting others to come along. I don't see it happening now. But I think that President Trump has clearly decided, let's give it one more go. Let's see if we can hit them very, very hard economically without, additional military force that could be coming. I don't think the president wants that.
He's run out of ammunition, Leslie. I mean, he's actually running out.
Well, exactly.
That's the reason why he's picking a trade war at the moment. But
trying to buy himself time.
Right.
But if it doesn't work, then perhaps we see a flip again towards some sort of negotiation and softer policy.
And of course, the language that Trump has used, the fairly bombastic language on Iran, and of course the Iranians have retaliated with their own very bombastic language. They're at each other's rhetorical throats all the time. But the more you say and nothing happens, the less you believe someone, understandably. I want to now pivot to Canada, because talking of rhetorical slagging matches. I mean, the Canadians are giving back as good as they're getting. So we've had this extraordinary exchange of insults between Canada and the US, for goodness sake, in the last 48 hours. Doug Ford, the Prime Minister of Ontario, has called Trump a loser. And then J.D. Vance has weighed in. He was giving a speech in Maine, which of course is in the middle of a serious Senate election campaign. And he's called Canada the 51st state. Oops, sorry, I meant nation. It was a Freudian slip. I mean, this is really childish playground stuff. But just talking about the economic impact, Soumaya, this has, $20 billion worth of tariffs over 60 American goods. I think a lot of it is to do with whiskey and bourbon. And then, of course, on the Canadian side, it's lumber and auto parts. Give us some idea, Soumaya, how damaging this could be, and for more damaging for which economy?
Yeah, so in terms of the US tariffs are on roughly, I think it's 5% of imports from Canada. So they are not huge. They are designed to be painful, though, right? You don't. That's you want to hit products that your trading partner finds it hard to find alternatives for, right? So,
like what,
they
for
will
instance?
have been carefully designed. Actually, in that original slate of US tariffs, cars were conspicuous in by their absence. Right?
Not anymore.
They kind of knew that that would be painful. I think Canada accounts for something like 8% of North American car production. Right? You don't want to raise prices for consumers, at least in the first instance. Canada has responded by saying it will match the tariffs dollar for dollar, so raise tariffs on the same dollar amount of trade. Now, Canada's economy is much, much smaller than America's. So as a share of its economy, that is a bigger sum.
Yeah.
And, that's part of why you see, you've seen the Canadian government just announced, support packages for companies hurt by these measures. I think everyone was hoping that the US threat would be delayed because they would be able to reach some deal. That doesn't look like it's going to happen. I would say, though, there are some notes of hope here, right? So the Canadians have said that their retaliatory package will only come into effect on September 8th. And the US's, extreme threats where they are saying they will bring in cars to their tariff package. Trump said that would only come in January. Now, to me, that looks like a classic, I'm inventing a new deadline for us to get a deal.
Right.
So yes, we have now had the US tariffs on this roughly $20 billion worth of goods. But there are future opportunities for some kind of climb down.
So are you saying that the bark is worse than the actual bite on this one, on both sides?
Well, I mean, the Trump administration has gone through with it, right? So this isn't a taco. They have actually applied these tariffs. So they've gone for it. The Canadians are kind of hoping that they will only have to bark and not bite, because the tariffs on US goods hurt their consumers as well. The Canadians have also said that perhaps there are other instruments they could use beyond just tariffs. So we'll see what those might be. This could all get pretty ugly if it is allowed to spiral. But every sign I can see suggests that they don't particularly want this to, at least at the kind of negotiator level.
Leslie, does Trump have a point that Canada's been getting an unfair trade deal? I mean, unfair for the Americans, very fair for the Canadians, that they've been fleecing the USA for years and years?
I think any serious trade economist would say, don't look at it bilaterally, look at it globally. And if you want to assume, as Trump now does, that economics and geopolitics are basically integrated, it's certainly been a wonderful partnership for the United States. I mean, I think the only thing that makes sense to me is that Donald Trump thinks that there's something in this politically by threatening tariffs on cars in a midterm election where always those upper Midwest states matter. Going into, a full election season, talking about cars, industrial workers in America, their jobs. I don't think it's getting a huge amount of play. The tariffs are not popular with the Americans. Canada is popular with Americans. And in Canada, it's simply serving to unite Canadians around Mark Carney and Doug Ford and everybody else. So politically, it seems like a gamble, like a stretch, like it's sort of an overplayed violin. But clearly, Donald Trump doesn't see it that way.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? If it doesn't make such a huge economic impact, I mean, let's see where it ends up, but it doesn't seem to be cataclysmic so far. It has had a significant political impact. And if you insult your closest allies and your nearest neighbors, they will fight back. Those quiet Canadians have found their voice through Mark Carney and others. And let's not forget that this all started not with the trade war, but with Trump more or less declaring on Inauguration Day that he wanted Canada to be the 51st state of the United States. And then Mark Carney very politely pointed out that he talked to a lot of the vendors, in other words, the citizens of Canada, and they weren't selling. To which Trump said, never say never. I mean, this is just, on one level, this is just a ridiculous political fight, started admittedly by Washington. And is that the most important thing here for this particular trade war, Samaya? It's the politics, not the numbers.
Yeah, the Canadians understand that they are negotiating on two fronts, right? They are negotiating with the Americans, and then they are negotiating for the benefit of Canadian public opinion. And they can shape that public opinion, and they have. President Trump, I think, has been much less careful or strategic about how to handle that double negotiation. I think, just thinking about the kind of international politics of this, right? There is a geostrategic question about what the US wants Canada to be.
Yeah.
So, you listen to a lot of the rhetoric, and President Trump seems to be vaguely aggrieved that Canada makes cars, right? There seems to be the sense that those jobs should come to the US. Okay, what if Canada stops making cars? What if Canada deindustrializes? Can the US feel secure that it's going to carry on buying loads of cars from the US? Or might it just say, okay, well, we only want to buy cars from China now because they're super cheap, right? And so there are these short-term economic considerations, but then there is this broader geostrategic question that the US seems a bit either confused, maybe just short-sighted in terms of what it's doing. Although, I would say that, final point, the Canadians are canny negotiators. They are extremely difficult to negotiate with. They know what they're doing. Speak to a British trade negotiator who was trying to deal with a Brexit rollover deal with the Canadians. It was not a fun experience. I reported on the renegotiation of the NAFTA trade deal when they got the USMCA. These are some deeply sophisticated trade negotiators with lots of experience. We should always question what they choose to release in terms of the narrative. They know that public opinion would be on side if they walked out, right? Who's going to believe them, right? Trump made some unreasonable demands, or Canada made some unreasonable demands. They know who people are going to believe.
And what do you think, actually, Samara, what do you think the truth is in this one? Because, of course, the Canadians are saying that Trump, Howard Lutnick, being the kind of main guy on this, made some very unreasonable Lutnick-like demands in the 11th hour, as in Canada couldn't stitch out trading relations or trading deals with other countries. They wanted the French language to somehow be extracted from a trading agreement. I don't know why they did that. Is because they thought that was far too European by nature. What's going on there? And are they right in saying that the Americans tried to impose unreasonable stuff right at the very end of a negotiation that had been going relatively well?
Yeah, so Jameson Greer is the United States Trade Representative, and he will have been negotiating, the details. Now, yes, Howard Lutnick, the report.
But he's the voice in the background, yeah.
Well, it sounds like he came in relatively late on in the process and made some extra demands. It would not be completely out of character if that was what happened. I think in terms of the requests, so one was French language. That was obviously never going to fly. Now, if you want to sell something in the English language into those markets, it's obviously very frustrating for you. But that kind of trade barrier, in inverted commas, don't bother, guys. They're not going to give it up. It's like telling the French.
Was that designed to annoy the Canadians, or was it actually something they really felt deeply about?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I'm sure some company will have told them it's annoying. It is on the list of trade irritants. But it's like the French. They're never going to give up their own protections for French language cinema. It's a cultural thing. It's not for sale.
Right.
So it is plausible that kind of demand would have been made. There are a bunch of other requests that I think fit into this geo-economic conflict that we all sit in. So it seems that the US demanded that Canada restrictions on who else Canada could sign trade deals with. It wanted exclusive access to their critical minerals, also something that Canadians not that keen on. So I can well believe that the US made some extreme demands. I can also believe that the shape of the deal so supposing this deal hadn't blown up, it's very possible that the Canadians would have had to accept higher tariffs than the very low tariff regime that they had before. That would have also been unpalatable. So it's possible that the Canadians had already decided that they didn't want this deal, and they were kind of looking for an excuse to get out.
Right.
That's what we don't really know, and there are very, very few people who I think actually do know.
Leslie, I mean, we keep, we're so used to Trump pulling out of stuff. We're so used to the kind of, taco moment. Are we missing the fact that there's a real moment of peril here for both economies, but especially the Canadian economy, that if the egos prevail and they ratchet things up, it could actually get really nasty?
Oh, absolutely. And this is why I think in time we will see a negotiation that gets everybody back to a good place. The puzzling thing to me about President Trump is that he still seems to be angling to mobilize his base around a narrative that is not really paying dividends to them, and that is certainly pushing the American public further away from his camp. And yet he's doubling down rather than switching tack. I think that sometimes our mistake in thinking about President Trump is thinking that he is thinking A, strategically, or B, in silos. So, Donald Trump wakes up, he looks at the world, Iran is not complying, China is winning, he's not getting what he wants from Canada. He's got a lot of domestic stuff going on in the last week or so, if you've been watching the U.S. news.
Yeah.
It's not a happy place for a president who's supposed to be enjoying, the last few weeks before the American Labor Day weekend. And so I think sometimes what we see is him just saying, double down on this. I don't like what these guys are doing. And he goes right back to his comfort spot, which is pushing hard on automobiles, pushing hard on tariffs, and pushing hard on Canada. And we try, as we're watching it, to make sense of it, to give it more strategic logic. There's certainly some of that. But I think, unfortunately, with this U.S. president, a lot of it is deeply personal.
And if Maggie Haberman from the New York Times, who wrote that wonderful book recently, Regime Change, is right, then he's still spending 70% of every week worrying about ballrooms and arches and helicopter landing pads at the White House, which is the stuff that he really cares about. So just to wrap it up, so he is fighting trade wars on so many different fronts. He's using trade sanctions as a political tool to try and bend countries to his will. It's not working particularly well. What is the result of all this? Is it a complete erosion of trust in the international trading system and America's role in it? Is it that countries and individual businesses are just making do and muddling through? So where are we, Samir? You first. Where are we in this weird reality, and how much more of it can we take?
Yeah, I think the reality is that when Trump first decided to blow up the world economy with his Liberation Day tariffs, there was a lot of doomsaying, and that hasn't come to pass, right? The economy has been more resilient than was warned about. I think, I happen to think that the pernicious effects of tariffs tend to show up slowly, right? They show up in, the lost innovation, the lost productivity, as everyone's having to work out what's going on with these kind of uncertain import taxes, essentially. There's a lot of academic evidence showing just how bad uncertainty is for investment. Just as you say, businesses not able to plan.
Yeah.
You don't want to be the chump that sinks multi-billions of dollars of investment into a country only to find out that actually your competitor can get it in at lower cost somewhere else and import it tariff-free. So you need to know. So none of this is good for the global economy. Yeah. It's not sort of disaster central. And I think, in reality, policymakers around the world are trying to wait until, the next president comes along with a slightly more coherent agenda, slightly more predictable agenda. And for now, there's just a lot of uncertainty. So not great, but not disaster.
Leslie, is the era of free trade, of global free trade that led to the prosperity of China and Southeast Asia, and so many countries around the world. If you look at general levels of poverty, although lots of people are still, whining and complaining, and often for very good reasons, the planet is much richer now than it was 50 years ago. Is that era over? And what does that do to global prosperity?
Look, it's absolutely over. And that, as we know, wasn't just Donald Trump. That was going to be Hillary Clinton. And had she actually won, the tide has been turning. I'm sitting here in Chicago. We like to say this is the part of the United States that built the neoliberal global trade and financial order, and needs to help kind of fix it. But that's certainly not coming back. The question is less about, in my view, as to whether it's coming back. I think it's not. It's about whether the United States is going to play a positive and productive role in renegotiating the rules to some sort of new trade and economic and also financial order that allows states once again to make accommodations domestically that they feel they need to make for social and economic and political reasons, but in a measured way that allows for the kind of certainty that Samaya has been talking about. And that is where I think America is missing in action, is disruptive, and where countries, if they could, would be, doubling down on other solutions today. But unfortunately, there's so much dependence on the U.S. that it's going to take some time to move beyond to reduce that.
Right. And what's the point of redefining trade rules led by the Americans in a more subtle way, if the next president who comes along might be even more draconian on trade than Trump. Or you might get a left-wing populist who says, we need protection here, Samaya. I mean, the genie's out of the bottle, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's important, though, to remember in this conversation that, Trump started his trade wars very loudly, but the bigger underlying trade conflict, trade tensions are with China. There are many other countries grappling with the challenge of China's, massive manufacturing machine, its willingness to dominate whole industries and then weaponize that dominance. So, that the hope is that there will be, another US president who is slightly more strategic in coping with that challenge. I'm actually a bit more pessimistic in that I'm not sure that there is some kind of global rules system that could emerge in the near-term future. I think we probably are in this kind of world of uncertainty for quite a while, just because that relationship between China and kind of Western economies does seem so fraught. But hopefully it will at least become more stable, and there will be more of a more strategic thinking behind how to handle that.
Which brings me to my final and genuinely very brief question. Should we be more afraid of an erratic, infuriating, rumbustious America, or a very calculating, incredibly domineering, cost-effective China? First you, Samaya.
Oh, they're both very scary, aren't they? So I think that. So I think if you are a trading partner of both of those two countries, right now there's a lot of rhetoric saying we need to pivot away from both, because yes, China is a problem, but the US is very erratic. And my view is basically in the medium term, whatever is going on with this particular president, the values and the system of the US and say countries in Europe is just much more aligned. There are more fundamentals in common there than there are with China. And so, thinking about the medium term, China is really the bigger challenge that we should be concerned by. That's obviously very difficult to, hold on to when the president is doing exactly what he's doing. But medium term, that's what I think.
Leslie, what do you think?
I think the U.S. is by far the bigger problem, and it's a version of what Somaya said. We know where China's heading. We know what the challenge is. And the problem is that we also know that if the United States, Europe, many Asian economies, and countries across the global south have the opportunity to work strategically with the United States, that there is every hope for growth, for prosperity, for stability, and for a set of values alignment. And so the real loss, the real fear is that America doesn't come back. That's the thing that moves the needle. U.S. leadership in a predictable and stable way. And let's call a spade a spade. We're not going to get it for 2 more years. Anybody that thinks that we are is simply, in my view, wrong. The hope, and I think the promise, is to invest across these economies below the headline of the White House. The U.S. is a huge economy. It's a huge country. Power is very decentralized, even though it doesn't always look that way. Stay in it for the medium term, play the long-term game. But I think that the big risk right now in the short term is the United States.
I think it sounds like we need some of that high tariff Kentucky bourbon that may not be sold in Canada anymore. And we'll have to redirect it to our studio. I mean, none of that's very cheerful. But thank you to both of you for outlining it in a brilliant way and shedding some light on what I think many would agree is important but complicated. And we all need to become trade experts, don't we, really? We all need to become, tariff and trade experts if we want to survive in this
there is
world.
A book that one can read to become a trade expert.
Indeed, I know it. And we mentioned it at the beginning of the podcast, Samaya Keynes, and we'll mention it again, How to Win a Trade War. Is that the right title? Yes, it is, isn't it? Anyway, Leslie, do you have a book to sell? This is your chance. No tariffs.
Not today, but
not today.
Plenty of writing to sell.
Next time out. Anyway, Leslie Vinjamuni and Samaya Keynes, thank you very much to both of you for joining me on Trump World for this week. And I hope that all of you out there enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you so much.